cut out all the word clouds and 3D pie charts that I originally had in my presentation, so always present yourself. But I always like to begin presentations with talking a little bit about what O'Reilly isn't. We're not O'Reilly Auto Parts. We're not, unfortunately, O'Reilly's Pub in San Francisco. And we're definitely not Bill O'Reilly. This is Bill O'Reilly from Fox News. You'd be surprised at how often O'Reilly is mistaken for Bill O'Reilly. But we're Tim O'Reilly. So this is Tim on the cover of Inc. magazine, where he's being sort of feted as a thought leader and visionary in some of the trends that are happening in technology. So some of the things that O'Reilly as an organization is noted for, we put the first ad on the web, so you can thank us for that. We invented the term Web 2.0, so you can thank us for that too, or you can chase me out of here right now. Also, the term open source came from an O'Reilly event, so that's another thing that came from the kind of company of innovation, as well as Make Magazine. That was a kind of a joint venture between Tim and Dale Doherty, who founded Make. So a long history of innovation and thought leadership has sort of allowed us to punch above our weight a little bit as an organization. But probably what we're best known for are books with the animals on the cover. So if you're a software developer or no one loved them, you've probably seen these on their desks or on their bookshelf. But we also do events. We run OSCON, which is an open source conference that happens now in Austin. We run Strata, which is a big data science conference at the Javits Center, and Velocity, which is about web operations and performance. And we also run Safari Books Online, which is kind of a big, giant library of digital books and videos. And for nearly 40 years, O'Reilly's books and conferences have been changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. That's what we see as kind of our mission, is really taking the knowledge that people who are thought leaders and alpha geeks in their field and making it accessible to everybody. And what I'd like to talk about today is really, how is this shift to digital going to shape what we do for the next 40 years, right? Because the company was founded in 1978, almost 40 years of publishing books. It's clear that the media landscape is changing a lot. So I want to just begin with a little bit of macro context to sort of set the stage. I don't think anything would be terribly controversial or anything that you're going to find surprising. But the first is this sort of trend of the shift from physical to digital, right? And this really began in the early 2000s, with books, newspapers, music, everything essentially becoming digital. So all this stuff that used to be physical media is now becoming stuff that you carry around on your phone or you access on the web. And that's really sort of happened in two big phases. The first phase you could think of as sort of the download phase, where you had MP3s that you would get a physical file, well, not a physical file, but you would get a file that you owned and you would put it on your device. And that model is really still prevalent in the publishing industry. So we have a lot of files that are called EPUBs, which are sort of digital representations of books. But most other media is going towards a streaming model now, where you don't really have a file. What you have is sort of a time-limited access to it, or you have access to it through some other thing, but you never actually have that on your device. The second sort of major trend is the sort of collapse of retail channels for physical media. So in 2010, this all began about 6-7 years ago. We saw the collapse of Blockbuster and video. In 2011, Borders closed, and then in 2013, Virgin shut down, right? So that's a lot of channels where physical media have been sold. So this was a really tough time, except for everybody who sold those yellow signs, that they always put on going out of business. So if you're in that business, you're doing great. The third trend is really the commodification of content. And I've sort of represented this as these Outbrain ads. You see them kind of everywhere. And it took me a while to find a representative example of an Outbrain ad that wasn't horrifying or disgusting and, or really offensive in some kind of way. But it's essentially this idea that content is becoming commodified because the distribution and production costs are essentially going to zero, right? So that's kind of a natural economic outcome of what happens with that. And I think it's not just on web content or text content. You also see this happening in varieties of other media. So I've kind of represented this broadly as the Property Brothers. Not that I don't have anything against the Property Brothers, but I mean, look at them. They look like they kind of came out of a box that said "bro." So it's definitely reality TV is kind of the outbrain of content. So it's not just text media. Now, so the effect that we've seen on publishing has been fairly pronounced. The data's a little bit hard to come by, but this is a chart, I think, from 2005, essentially showing revenues in the publishing industry down by about 23%, right? So definitely a pronounced trend. But the thing that should probably keep people who are in the media business or the news business up at night is this chart. So this was I found in an article by Clay Shirky called Last Call on Medium, and it's essentially an analysis of what's happening to ad revenues in the newspaper industry. And what you can see here is if you're, so it's showing inflation-adjusted revenue since 1950. And if you're sitting at the top in 1950, in 2000, you think you've got a pretty good run going, right? But in the last 10 years, we've seen the collapse of 50 years of inflation-adjusted value, right? So it's a very sudden collapse. And this is the kind of chart that, looking at the future of not just O'Reilly, but other kinds of people who make media and create media, this is the kind of collapse that I think we need to be looking always in the kind of the rearview mirror to see what, to guard against. So, it was not a long time that, there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and hand-wringing about this, but, you've seen organizations who do media and make media begin to respond. And probably one of the first and primary responses has been in this shift away from having customers to having subscribers. And you particularly see this in the television media or in music, right? So Netflix and Hulu, Spotify, Amazon Prime. So what they're selling you is access to a large library of content, and then you essentially are just paying them a monthly fee. And that's kind of the model that's begun to emerge in a lot of different in a lot of these different industries, but not in publishing. Publishing still very much is, we've got this file and you download it and you read it on your Kindle or your iPad or whatever it is. So again, not across the board, but a definite mega trend. The second is really, and this is a really promising thing that kind of really excites me, is the move towards providing exclusive content through those channels. So you see this in Netflix has this great series called Stranger Things, and kind of like this whole talk was just a ruse that I could just say, hey, Stranger Things is really great. But you see it with HBO, that essentially creating custom premium content that's going to attract and retain subscribers is the strategy that goes along with the subscription model. And it's not simply media, it's not simply video or music. You see it on sites like The Upshot, on The Times, and 538 are creating these new kinds of experiences and these new kinds of things that are really only available in that channel if you want to consume it, in order to bring people there and keep them on, within that kind of base of subscribers. And there's a great book called by Tim Wu called The Master Switch, which really goes into the history and economics of this. And it's basically a replay of the studio system, which was really the way when Hollywood began organizing. The studios owned the means of distribution, right? So they owned all the movie theaters that you would go to. And then there was something called the star system, which, the famous stars that we know and we think of as like the classics from the golden age of Hollywood were signed to long-term contracts. And so they worked within that system as exclusives. And, the benefit of this, besides the horrible antitrust and all the other bad things about it, was it produced what's called generally the golden age of film, right? So these are the things when you think about Hollywood, when you think about the classics of the movie industry, they were produced under this system. And I don't think it's a coincidence that people talk about the golden age of TV, right, or the golden age of media that's happening right now. I think the economics are very similar, so there's a lot to learn from this book. And he goes into not just TV, not just media, but also cable or technology, other kinds of areas where you see these effects. So where does that leave us? What are the imperatives for publishers in this system, right, or media producers? First, it's a subscriber-based channel, right, so that you have a kind of a model that's not just based on individual clicks or individual sales to a customer, and you're able to fill that channel with compelling and exclusive content. And so I want to delve just a little bit for publishers into what our kind of tool chain looks like for how do we actually fill that channel right now, and then a little bit I want to contrast it with what I think we should be doing. But going back to about 1985, I think is where you can sort of date the beginning of the modern publishing tool chain. And this is the desktop publishing revolution. So this is when you were writing a book or creating some content in that industry, you started with Aldus PageMaker, you printed it out on your laser writer, and you sent your manuscript out in the mail and got a bunch of feedback and got it back and collated it. 10 years later, we had Windows 95. And there you mostly, was a very similar process. You still printed and mailed things, but now you also had the option of emailing it through this funky thing called, AOL, which, at the time, I don't know if anybody knows AOL, right? They used to have these CDs that came in all the magazines, and you could never get rid of them or find something to do with them, and your parents probably still have a subscription to it. It just won't die. Then by 2005, was the innovation of Word 2003, so whatever. But by that point, the kind of model was really established of you would print some things, but mostly you were using Gmail and emailing things by that point, and then you were using this track changes feature to kind of get everybody's comments and merge them all back together. Which leads us to, to today. So if I could make a little sound come up, I would do that. This is kind of the state of the art for my industry. It's Google Docs, which is a system full of northern charm and southern efficiency. It's kind of the worst of all options, but it's the thing that everybody uses and likes, right? And so it provides a way to author your document, to get feedback, to have text. So it provides a full workflow, but it's just not a very good tool, especially if you're doing much longer works or things that might have a lot of images or might have a lot of graphics or have a lot of other dependencies. So it's a poor tool for that use. And then the final sort of step as we look for, at least how the publishing industry operates to getting that content, that Google Docs content out, is we take that, we turn it into a PDF, we send it off to India to there's a group of companies called production houses, and what they basically do is take your PDF and convert it to an EPUB for you manually, and then they send you back a file that then you can go and you can distribute through the chains, through the digital formats. So, really in workflow and form, right, the mental models that we've had in the publishing industry are still pretty fundamentally the same as the desktop publishing model that started, in 1985, right? So there's not been a lot of innovation. But what I'd like to talk about now is what O'Reilly's approach has been to the changes in digital, which really are around shifting from that desktop publishing thought world into one that's much more based on a software model and thinking about producing content in the same way that you would produce software and the advantages and the benefits that that's had for us. So first, there's sort of three key principles behind the system that we've been using, right? And I should mention, we've been doing this for about 5 years, so if you've had an O'Reilly book or seen an animal book, this is the way that we produced it using what I'm telling you here. First is structured markup, the second is transformation engines, and the third principle is version control. So for structured markup, it's essentially allowing people who are creating this content to use languages like Markdown, which probably, how many Markdown is yeah, okay. So Markdown is like a glorified email, essentially. It's a very nice, clear way to write. ASCII-Doc, which is basically if you need to do things like represent cross-references or bibliographies or more complex kinds of structures, ASCII-Doc is a language that allows you to do that. So it's a lot like the things you get after you've worked with Markdown long enough to realize it doesn't quite get you all the way, right? ASCII-Doc is the tool for that. But a lot of our authors write in HTML. Many also write in a tool called DocBook, which is an XML format for very complex, typically things like scientific or medical or other kinds of documents that are very complicated in nature. The second leg of the stool are what I call transformation engines. If you're familiar with static site generators, it's basically the same content, right? So we take that structured content, we run it through a process that, like a program, it could be, we have our own internal one, but it could be Jekyll or Hugo or any of a number of tools. And then we apply all the styling and all the transformation needed to turn it into a PDF or an EPUB or a MOBI or any of the other formats that we want. So there's a very clear separation of the content itself from the final format, just like there is on the web. And then the third, I think really and the most important, is version control, right? Of being able to store content and all the associated assets that go along with a project, right? So you don't just have a book, you've got images, you have text, you have tables, you might have the output of a program. You've got a lot of things that are complex in nature. You can just kind of dump them into Git and track them all in one single place. And then we enable collaboration through a branching and merging workflow so that you can have lots of different people all authoring and working in the documents at the same time. And then the Git has a protocol for allowing you to reconcile all those changes together. And you're also able to tap into sort of the broad community on GitHub, right? So content can not just be something that an individual author or a few people get to participate in. By putting it on GitHub, it creates a social ecosystem where other people can contribute. And then finally, you can use Git hooks, which are basically things that fire when you make a commit, to automate a lot of the workflows. So if you need to build a PDF or you need to republish your documents or do any kind of automated workflow, you have a very well understood mechanism for doing that. One of the things that we've had a lot of success with, if you're thinking about this, is we use a tool called GitLab, which is basically like a self-hosted version of GitHub. And the reason is, as we got into this whole process, we realized we're very different from most software companies in that you have a few big projects with a lot of contributors. We have just a lot of projects with maybe just a few contributors, right? So we have about 5,300 projects right now in the system that have gone through this. So there's a lot of projects. So trying to pay those private repo bills we're getting high. So GitLab is definitely, it's a great tool if you're interested in running your own big Git repository. And the outcome has really been we estimate about 60% cost savings on some of the production, and most of that has to do with that separation of content and format. Right, we're able to, a lot of the cost of producing a book or these kinds of medias and page breaking and page layout and all these kinds of things that are generally very manual, but we're able to automate a lot of that through the kind of through this workflow approach. And it's also allowed us to repurpose the kinds of skills and things that our production group would be. So we were able to, instead of having a production group that only did books and a production group that could then go do web, we were able to just retrain and retool so that the same people who do copy editing and fact checking and all the kinds of things that go into making really high quality content, they're able to do that both online and in the web also. And that's been a big boost, not only for the efficiency, but also just in helping people get more the skills that they need for kind of moving into the next generation of media. And the third is really continuous publishing. And this is something I mentioned, just having your content in Git and having access to this sort of giant network of people who are able to contribute to contribute changes and make things, it changes the way you think about how you're publishing, right? You're not done, you're able to put it out and people are able to contribute and use suggestions and modifications in the same way they could with an open source project. And this is a project, I wrote a small guide, an introduction to Docker, put it on GitHub just as a test. I got 2,700 stars and 14 contributors, and just lots and lots of interest in this kind of documentation as a project on GitHub. And really where we're sort of lacking is in the legal infrastructure in the publishing industry to accept those, commit those changes back in, right? There's a well-understood model in software for doing that. We're much further behind in publishing as far as that aspect. But so I've got the sort of this three-pronged strategy, right? The version control, transformation engines, and structured markup has really helped us get to market more quickly, and it's helped us do it lower cost, it's more efficient, and blah, blah, blah. But it's really not changed the nature of what we produce. And I think that's where we really need to get at the kinds of things where we're going to make the compelling tools. And so what I'd like to talk about a little bit is that, how are we going to change the form, not just of a book so that it's just an efficiently produced book that you could have had in 1985, to something that's unique and new and that's going to drive the kind of interest that you see sites like 538 in the Upshot doing. And what I would offer is Jupyter Notebooks, I think, is a great platform that we've had tremendous success with, that a lot of our authors have said you have to use this thing, you have to support this thing. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an open source authoring tool for what's called narrated computation. So it allows you to have programs in which you can intermix text and images and formulas and all sorts of things in a very nice presentation. It was founded by Fernando Perez, who was at Berkeley and now is at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And he's going to be at PLOTCON on Thursday, so you'll get to hear from himself. I promise I'm not going to scoop. Oh, there he is. I promise not to scoop anything that he would say. And they estimate about 2 to 3 million users, right, are using this system. So it's very widely established. It's got a very rich user base and community. And the reason is it does pretty much all the things that I was talking about earlier from the software perspective, but makes it accessible for people who are doing content all in one tool. It's organized in this concept of cells. So in a cell, you can put in Markdown, you can put in headers, you can put in equations. So it's got an authoring environment that's rich. There is a coding environment as well. So if you put a code sample in, and you can just hit the run button, it'll just run. And it's just showing you the live output of your program, which you can understand if you're a company like O'Reilly that makes lots of documentation about code, this is beneficial. But also if you're doing visual analysis or data journalism, or we heard earlier I believe it was The Guardian putting some of their content out as data sets as with Jupyter Notebooks as the interface, right? It gives you a very rich way to distribute that code. But probably more compelling is the inline charting features. So you can have a program that produces a chart, and then that's just output directly from the code and the data that you have in your Git repository and in your notebook. It's just live. And so you're able to regenerate it on the fly if you need to. And it's not just matplotlib. It's pretty much got every kind of support for every kind of tool that you can think of. And those charts can be made interactive. So with just a few small changes, you can say, well, this is some work I did with a group doing radio interferometry, and they wanted to visualize how these different waves would interact if you change the amplitude and the frequency. And with just one line of Python, you can make bind these variables to sliders in the UI, and the Jupyter Notebook just does it for you, so that you as the user can just kind of play with the values and see what happens in your model without having to go in and change a bunch of values and do code. And it's just a very nice way to sort of bridge the gap between people who might not be comfortable with coding, but give them an interface that'll allow them to still have a great experience with that. There's also a very strong ecosystem in the community. There's a tool called NBconvert that will allow you to take these notebooks and change them into all sorts of different formats, HTML, LaTeX, PDF, and this tool kind of plays the role of the static site generator that I mentioned earlier, right? You're able to just go across the board for almost anything that you can think of. There's Jupyter Hub for running large, centralized installs. So say you're a university and you want to give a class access to a bunch of notebooks. I think Matt earlier showed My Binder, which is a way to give somebody a live notebook from the web. This is a similar idea, but it's something you run internally. There's a tool, NBViewer, that lets you take a notebook and publish it out just on the web as a static page so that you can share your work easily with others. Again, huge support for charting, graphing, and visualization tools. Plotly's in there, Bokeh. There's just, every Seaborn. There's just a bunch of different libraries for visualization, and GitHub support. If you take your Jupyter project and put it on GitHub, people will see it rendered in a really beautiful and compelling way, and then be able to download it and have access to it. So what we've really been experimenting with is how do we take all these components, the authoring tool and the ability to run code, right? And it's not just Python. There's 50 different languages that it can support, and remix that to create new kinds of media. So this is a project that we call Orioles, and the idea is that you have a process or a tool that's in a notebook, and you want to allow somebody to kind of narrate their work. So this is Peter Norvig talking about regular expressions. And so you're able to see here, you can watch the video of him giving you a little bit of color commentary on what he's doing, then scroll through automatically as he's saying, oh, and now we're going to talk about this particular regular expression. And then you said pause now and try it in the browser, right? So you're able to run it in the browser, and then you can resume it when you want. So it's a way of really mixing other kinds of media beyond just pure flat text. So I just kind of want to conclude. I think Jupyter is my sort of leading candidate. Jupyter and other tools that are out there, like Interact is another great project that's part of this sort of ecosystem of tools that are emerging around these new kinds of authoring platforms that really provide a lot of the power of the desktop publishing model. There's a reason why it lasted 35 years. It did a great job, but it's just vastly more powerful tooling, and it's also much more digital and web friendly, right? So all the things that you want to use, you can use in this environment and get it out to people. It's broadly supported, and again, it's extensible. Whatever kinds of new frameworks, I'm sure someone is working right now on a Regal extension, a kernel for Jupyter that'll be able to do all the sorts of things that you were looking at with the shaders earlier today, in this one platform. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Oh, okay. So we have 3 minutes. Yeah. So the question is, elaborate a little bit on the legal uncertainties that open source books are facing. And I'm not a lawyer, so don't go off and take this and make a huge decision on it. But it's essentially, in the open source world, you have varieties of licensing models to let you do what you want with software. Right? There's Creative Commons, there's MIT, there's GPL. The publishing world doesn't really have that. So there's this notion of a contributed work where you have multiple people who are doing things, and typically royalties and the contracts and the structures of these contracts are about assigning some percentage of the royalty to people based on their contributions. So it's hard to meter, it's hard to measure those kinds of things. And again, you can forego that and just say, well, I'm just going to release it. But if you want to have a context where someone is legally, where you're as a publisher is legally bound to pay royalties based on that, that's where the difficulties lie. Yep. So the question is, do we just throw Git at people? And the answer is kind of yeah, but we do have so it's a little bit difficult to say because we are, our core bread and butter authors are software developers, right? So they're used to these tools, and often when we first started this, they were sort of aghast that we didn't already have it, right? But obviously, lots of other developers or people who are just writing normal kinds of books don't want that experience. So what we've seen is the emergence of tools that put a layer on top of Git. There's our internal tool is called Atlas. There's a tool called Overleaf, which is another way of kind of you can do your work and hit save, and it kind of does all the Git commands in the background. There's a tool called Authoria that I believe they're going to be speaking about soon, and that's another great way for taking Git and really hiding a lot of the complexities and the things that you would normally do behind a nice, well-designed UI. But yeah, I mean, it's, I think to get the real power, you should be doing it at the command line, but also there's good alternative solutions, so you don't have to do that. We have time for another. Okay, a couple more. Yep. I mean, the thing is, so the question is, Stack Overflow has a documentation thing. What do we think about it? I'm excited about it. So my background, I'm a software developer. This is the thing. As a consumer and as a person who uses that documentation, I think it's awesome. As a person who is kind of tasked with, what do we do about the future? Obviously, there is some trepidation, but I think providing a really well thought out, structured narrative that takes you from point A to point B or C or Q. That's a very different proposition, and I think that's what people look to long-form and rich media for. And Stack Overflow is great if you, if you have quick hits. I think the documentation is good, but it's a lot of work to produce really good documentation. I mean, ask anybody who does software development. Like, I wrote that Git guide, and I got 14 people contributing, but most of them were very tiny little things, right? You still, I think, are going to need people who really understand a subject, who are the innovators, who are going to be able to explain it in a comprehensive way. So I have a kind of a wait and see. I'm not quaking in my boots about it, but I also think it could be really exciting. Any other, maybe one last question? Okay. Yeah.
Your structure for your GitHub is very similar to our organization. We do a lot of scientific app documentation. It's both done in-house but also done by our users.
Yep.
I was wondering if you could speak to the organization of your repos, and are there advantages to structuring that different ways when you have 5,000 projects that people are contributing to?
Yeah, so the question is how do we sort of structure the use of the structure of the Git repositories and organizing them? Part of it is we have a series of brands that are already sort of established, right? So there's an animal book, and there's a missing manual book, and there's a bunch of different, there's a taxonomy that we sort of just model using organizations. So if you're familiar with GitHub teams and organizations, it's similar to that. And GitLab has that also, so it's got a very rich set of of ways that you can tag and do things like that. But at the broadest level, I would say it's just on that taxonomy based on the series, and then looking at the individual teams with the specific contributors to the authors and the co-authors. And one of the things that we found that's really powerful is letting authors self-manage a lot of that stuff. So you might get a team for a book that is in an organization for animal books, but it's up to you to invite the people you want to be contributors and collaborators on it. But yeah, it's a little bit, there's not a huge, I don't have a cut and dried answer on the best way to do it, but that's how we've done it. Okay, are we? Great, okay, thank you so much.